Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today we're pleased to speak to Brother Abdirahman Ikar. How are you, Akhi Abdirahman?
I'm doing great, Alhamdulillah. How are you, Brother Bassam?
Alhamdulillah, I'm doing very well. Inshallah, today we'll be speaking about a very important subject, homeschooling. More and more Muslim parents are becoming growingly interested in this mode of educating their children. Yet, several misconceptions surrounding homeschooling remain prevalent. And today, with Brother Abdurrahman, we hope to better educate ourselves about this subject, inshallah. Now, before we dive straight into it, Akhi Abdurrahman, perhaps we could start us off by telling our viewers about yourself and your own personal homeschooling journey.
Yes, so Jazakallah khairan. Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. Welcome everyone. To just give some important details about myself. Every homeschooling journey is unique. Mine is all over the place. So I graduated with an undergraduate degree in biology. And then I worked as a clinical lab scientist in a leading hospital for about 2 years. I realized that I absolutely hated it. So I actually went back to school, did a master's in teaching English. And I got to teach while I was doing that program. And then immediately after that, I got hired to teach at a university in Medina. And I remember our family was so excited about it, but the visa never came. It was totally legitimate. It's just the visa never came. So subhanAllah, that actually led me to get further into the world of education. I became a high school teacher and I taught English and I taught math at a public school. And then I decided to go back to my hometown and I got a job working as a lecturer and as a counselor at a university. And throughout that time, I was always working in Islamic weekend schools. So the interesting thing about my story is that it's the combination of all of these things that have really culminated in me becoming a homeschooler. Ultimately, being in the healthcare field, having a successful career that I didn't like, that I ended up leaving in healthcare, and then after that, being in the world of education and working in Islamic weekend schools, all of that encouraged me to begin homeschooling myself. And we've been homeschooling now for the past 5 years. And it's been a wonderful experience altogether. So I want you guys to know that, these are not just random ideas that I came up with. It really is based on, my experience working in all of these different fields.
MashaAllah, MashaAllah. So what does homeschooling look like then? Is it like an identical replication
Uh,
of a school classroom in your living room, or how does it work exactly?
you know, when you first mention homeschooling to people, that's the first thing that they think about, right? They think about a desk setup in the living room. And ultimately, homeschooling looks absolutely different depending on who the family is, depending on the person who's homeschooling. So it can look like traveling the world with your family as your kids explore different languages and cultures. It can look like kids learning chemistry while they're cooking alongside you. It can look like a child memorizing Quran next to his parents. Or it can look more like a traditional school. So ultimately, it looks however you want it to look. Uh, and there are the legal requirements, but ultimately, if you live in a place that allows homeschooling, at least for me, I know that I was definitely surprised by the level of flexibility there was in homeschooling, even though I live in a state where there's considered to be moderate restrictions when it comes to homeschooling. Alhamdulillah, in the majority of countries and states in the West, you can homeschool. Of course, there's exceptions to that. And we'll talk more about legal issues later on. But homeschooling looks the way you want it to. And this is part of what makes it attractive, that you get to decide. You get to decide as a parent. And one thing that I tell parents is that no one can ever love your child the way that you do. No one can ever care about your child as much as you do. So yes, while it can be intimidating, that emotional connection, that love that you have for your child, no one else can replicate that. So while it's intimidating, right, it's also really powerful because you are being allowed to connect with your child on a daily basis, right, and being able to instill values in them.
So, I mean, as a segue right now into into that. So, I mean, why should Muslim parents even consider homeschooling? Because, I mean, schools exist for a reason, right? So, why even consider homeschooling?
Yeah. So when it comes to, talking about why we should consider it when there's this option right here, right next to us that's free and that is convenient, right? Obviously, there have to be some very strong reasons why we should decide to homeschool. And I could talk about this topic forever. But for the interest of time, I think what I'll do is I'll focus on just 5 specific reasons why I think Muslim parents should homeschool. The first reason is in order to ingrain taqwa and the love of Islam in our children. What this means, though, is that we have to really understand more about public schools. Public schools ultimately teach a value system that in a lot of ways opposes Islam. And this is the reality. Now, the other thing we need to understand is that this isn't something that just started now, right? I think so many parents, right now, there's this sort of awakening across so many communities, not just amongst Muslim communities, but even amongst conservative Christians, for example, right? Oh, we need to homeschool. And I give the analogy that when it comes to the public school system, think of the public school system, right? And the ideologies that they support. Think of secular liberalism sort of as the disease, right? For lack of a better word, right? And then advancing these specific topics that have come more to the forefront later, more recently, this is a symptom, right? So the actual issue is secular liberalism. And all of these things stem from that. So for example, these recent ideologies that are being pushed more, right? This is just another symptom. It is not the main issue. Even before this issue, I believe that ultimately being in a public school for a Muslim child would be something that in a lot of ways would hurt their understanding of their own Muslim identity. And this is something that we need to understand. Public schools, it's not just for the sake of education. So many parents, especially immigrant parents, think school equals education. No, it's also promoting certain values. It's also making sure that everyone thinks in a uniform way. It's not just teaching skills, it's teaching values, it's teaching views, it's teaching identity, and it's having a population that is uniform. So for example, what education, for those of us who live in the US, what education does the Pledge of Allegiance really hold? What educational value does it hold? No. The reason it was established is so that immigrants who are coming into this country can all have the same value system. So I want you all to think of, just a typical day in the life of a public school student and how problematic this can be for a young Muslim. So yes, we're talking about secular liberalism as a whole, but even besides that, when we look at the individual daily activities, it's almost as if we're expecting a child to go to school and to walk around telling all the adults around them, this is against my religion. This is against my religion. This is against my religion. Perhaps they go into music class and they're required to play a musical instrument. So they say, this is against my religion. Perhaps they go to gym class where they're required to touch the opposite gender. And then they say, this is against my religion. And then in art class, they're told to draw a living thing, the face of a human, a self-portrait. And then they say, this is against my religion. And then at lunch, they say, well, I can't eat this. This is against my religion. What happens is that the child in their own development, in their own view, starts to see Islam as very restrictive, right? And yes, as the Prophet ﷺ said, Jannah is surrounded by desires, right? Islam is restrictive, right? Ad-dunya sijnul mu'min wa jannatul kafir. This world is the prison for the believer and the paradise for the disbeliever. Yes, there are restrictions in Islam, but the child who goes to public school begins to think that Islam is all about restrictions, that all we have is restrictions, right? And not only that, now think about the peer influence on top of that and issues of promoting premarital sex, drugs, and fantilizing young people, which so many young Muslims themselves are starting to realize that they're constantly being told, you're just a child. No, don't worry about it. Discover, right? Explore. You're just a child, right? And also downgrading the respect and the values that we have toward elders. So imagine now they see anything religious as inferior and they see Islam as limiting. This isn't the ideal environment. Now, you have to understand that when it comes to these public schools as well, that the religion or in the value system of secular liberalism that it directly opposes religion, right? So when I think back to my own public school education, I see that there was always an attempt to pit religion against science, to put these two against each other. Thinking back to hearing the story about Galileo and his persecution from the church, right? Because between Christianity and religion, there was always a conflict. But Islam didn't have that conflict. But that's not really something that's brought up in public education. So you see, our child now grows up in an environment where they see Islam as limiting. They see Islam as backwards. They're surrounded by peer influences. So all of that together is just the biggest and the main reason. Some other reasons that Muslim parents should consider homeschooling. The second reason is that public schools generally have a pretty terrible record when it comes to educational outcomes. In the US, 36% of fourth graders only 36% are proficient in math, and 26% of eighth graders are proficient in math. For reading, and this is the United States, we have 33% of fourth graders are proficient in reading, and only 31% are proficient in eighth grade when it comes to reading. So now we're talking about a system that goes against our beliefs, that goes against our values, that provides all of this negative peer influence and doesn't even produce secular results, right? Now, as far as specific data comparing homeschooling students and public school students, there isn't like a large scale, high quality study that is methodologically sound that compares the two. But ultimately, there's some really important factors that we have to think of. And one of the most important things in terms of academic secular result that we really have to think about is when it comes to teacher-student ratio, that our children in public schools are being put in an environment where you might have 25, 30 students, right, in one class. This cannot be a way to set up students for success. It simply cannot be. While the homeschooling student has one-to-one attention, or in a homeschooling co-op, maybe 5-to-1, the student-teacher ratio, right? So you think of all of these factors and you realize that it's not really setting the kids up for academic success. Yes. Now, there were some smaller scale studies that showed higher levels of success when it came to national exams for homeschooled students, especially students that were homeschooled in a way that had structure, which is required anyway. And really without, if you plan to fail, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail anyway, right? Ultimately. So I think that's another important reason. As far as the third reason, strengthening your relationship with your child. Now, I don't mean to make this just a lecture of, this is not meant to be a khutbah, but at the same time, we have to realize that we have a responsibility over our children. As the Prophet ﷺ said, "Kullukum ra'in wa kullukum mas'ulun an ra'iyatih." Every one of you is a shepherd, and every shepherd is responsible for his flock. And he goes on to mention the responsibility of a father and the responsibility of a mother. Your children, and I tell parents this all the time, because oftentimes as parents, our stressors are money. And our kids see that, right? That we're thinking about paying bills, that we're thinking about their own careers later on, and whether they'll be able to provide for themselves later on. But always remember as a parent that your children, what they will truly remember is not the toys that you gave them. It's not the things that you bought for them. Those things that you might be sweating for, those things that, you're always thinking about, they're not even caring about that. In the long run, what they will remember is the positive memories that you created with them. So many parents, they try to offload their parental responsibilities on someone else, but know that your children are a hiba, they're a gift, they're an amana, they're a trust, right? And this homeschooling experience, when it's done the right way, can allow you to have a positive relationship with your child, a relationship where later on they see you as an advisor, as a friend in their lives, as someone they can turn to, rather than their relationship with you being estranged by the public school system that teaches that families are often limiting, right? That doesn't teach respect for elders, along with the peer influence related to that. And the fourth reason I think that Muslim parents should consider homeschooling is that public schools depersonalize learning. What they do is they treat all students as the same. they treat all students as the same, right? And what that does is that it takes away the individual curiosity that a child has, right? So I'll give you guys an example. With homeschooling, let's say that you find that your child is just really interested in rocks out of all things.
Mm,
Well, now you can create a whole unit on that. You can
mm,
go into depth about that. You can connect that to Islam, right? There's so much that you can do, right? You can connect that to understanding that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created these things as a sign for us to believe in him. You can connect it back to monotheism, connect it back to Tawheed, right? But the school system is not doing that. So what this does is that this depersonalizes the learning experience for the student. But with homeschooling, you can personalize it. You can make it customized. And anything that's customized is ultimately better for that person's own individual, that child's own individual development. And the last reason, and again, I could go on forever, but the last reason is that public schools don't give your child, in most cases, a good role model.
mm,
And I don't think we should shy away from this, that a child looks up to his teachers.
mm,
A child looks up to her teachers, right? This creates a power dynamic, right? Where perhaps the teacher has a certain value system, and they might not even know that they're evangelizing or that they're proselytizing that specific value system that they have, but they are. Just their presence is, the way they dress, the way they speak about their own family. Allah Azza wa Jalla says, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ. That certainly we have made in the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam a good example. This is the example that we want them to take. And surely the public school system is not going to support that. But a homeschool child can have that emphasized to them. And this allows them to be more successful in the akhirah. And as we see from many of the scholars of the past, that Hassan al-Basri, for example, rahimahullah, he says that we have never seen someone who sought the dunya and also got the akhirah. But we've seen many examples of those who sought the akhirah and got the dunya as well. So when your child's akhirah is successful, they'll get the dunya as well, inshallah.
inshallah. Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, so let's say you've convinced someone to start homeschooling. So maybe the first immediate question might be, what qualifications should I have to be able to homeschool my kid?
That's a great question. So first, we have to start off with the legal requirements. Now, I recognize that our viewers, could be anywhere in the world, right? So it's important to understand the legal requirements when it comes to homeschooling. Again, there's even certain European countries where it's not something that's allowed, right? So for those of us in the US, homeschooling requirements differ from state to state. But overall, when you really look at the requirements, it's actually pretty relaxed. I know, there's certain organizations that say this state is aggressive, this state, has a lot of strict controls, but there's no state that doesn't allow homeschooling. And there's no state that doesn't allow homeschooling, even the strictest of states, for a parent who has, I think the strictest requirement was a parent who has 45 college credits, right, which is about 3 semesters of college. That's the strictest state. I think that was Washington, right? So it's important that you know the legal requirements. Now, that can be solved by a simple Google search, right? And, looking at local homeschool groups and what resources they recommend. For those of us in the US, the HSLDA, the Homeschooling Legal Defense, I forgot what the A was, Alliance, or whatever it is a great resource where you can go state by state and see the legal requirements. So it's important to know these, right? Because you don't want anyone to come after you later. Although it's important for parents to understand that with homeschooling, although there might be all of these requirements, right, to let's say to different states have different requirements on perhaps hours of teaching or subjects that are being taught. It is very rare that the government will come after you for homeschooling your child and say, show us the proof that you've been homeschooling. And also, there's very minimalist ways to keep track of homeschooling as well. So the legal requirements in the US, usually not an issue. And in other countries, of course, look at your local laws. Now, that's the legal requirement. However, there's some practical requirements that you need to have, right? So here's a list of some practical requirements that you want to make sure that you have before beginning homeschooling. The first reason is the first practical requirement is that you need to have a solid understanding of why you want to homeschool. First of all, you need to know your why, right? If you don't know your why, the moment you run into a little hiccup, you're like, oh, I'm taking my kids back to public school, right? I'm taking them back, right? So you need to know your why. Why are you doing this, right? Now, the other reason this is important is that this needs to be explained to other members of the family, because a lot of times what will happen is perhaps one parent wants to homeschool, the other one doesn't. Or sometimes what will happen is that the parent wants to homeschool and the child doesn't. So again, you need to know your why. You need to know what it is. What is the reason why you're doing this? What is your mission as a family? And as Muslims, ultimately, our mission is to go to Jannah. This is our mission as Muslims. Our mission is to guide our family to that. Now, only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can ultimately guide, but at least to give the best resources that we can, to give the best experience that will be more likely to lead to that, right? This is a responsibility that we have as parents. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that you need to have time. Now, everything that I'm about to list always goes back and connects to the first thing of your why. Because if you don't know your why, then now you don't have time, right? Because it's not as important to you, right? So you need to have time to homeschool. Now, as far as specific time, each child is different. Again, homeschooling is a personalized experience, right? So I can't say that each child requires this amount of hours, right? But I recommend starting with at least an hour a day, unless your state requires specific contact hours. Then there's ways to supplement with other things that we'll get into later as well. But at least 1 hour per child per day, right? I think this is a great starting point. Now, that hour, of course, it doesn't have to be all at once, right? Every kid has a different attention span. It can be 15 minutes at a time. It can be 20 minutes at a time. And the beauty of that is that you are growing in your relationship with your child and you're customizing it for them. And what your child is additionally getting out of this is that they're learning their best learning style. They're learning how it is that they learn best. This is so important because it's not a one size fits all picture. Some students learn best by visualizing. Some students learn best by reading, right? So you're able to cater to the individual needs of your child, right? And the individual time needs as far as, spaced repetition, which is the best way to learn anything, at least the best way to memorize anything, which is a core component of learning, which, by the way, public schools want to go against now. They want to say memorizing is not important, right? Of course it is. The more you know something, the less you have to look up, right? The more it's just inside of you, right? The more you can really live that, right? So
I can imagine some people listening to what you just said right now thinking,
yeah,
I don't want my child to just learn for an hour while everyone else's kids learning for like 8 hours a day. But it goes back to a previous point that you made, which is that, okay, the amount of material that a teacher could cover to help all 30 students in a class properly understand, and the majority of them will not properly understand it. Yep. You could probably help your kid in 5 minutes with that quality one-to-one interaction. Come up to speed, and it'll be more fruitful and beneficial and productive than that 45-minute class, along with 30 other kids, right? So, it's not about the quantity of time, but the quality of time. Yes. So 1 hour of quality one-to-one, undivided attention with a teacher, mainly you, the parent, is probably more valuable than this 8 hour, and not only that, your kid is like tired after half the day is already over, right? So,
SubhanAllah, you reminded me of a meeting that I had with a parent just recently. Now, I had met with this parent last year, and they weren't able to start homeschooling last year. But one of the things that I told them to do was just go to your kid's school with them and see if you can volunteer there and see if you can just see what that's like, right? So this parent, she went to the school. And she said, I was absolutely shocked. She said, I was floored. The teacher wanted to show a 5-minute video to the students. She said that it took 2 hours, right? So exactly what you said, right? It took 2 hours to show this 5-minute video. Because the other thing that parents are not factoring in is the behavioral issues.
Yeah.
Right? So, and this is why the teacher-student ratio is so important, is that a lot of school is actually just spent trying to calm down the troublemakers, right? Like a large part of school, right? Coming from a former public school teacher, a large part of it is just calming down the students who are troublemakers. Students who will, I've seen it, like curse at a teacher. Students who will just spaz out, right? Students who, insist that they're going to have their phones out, right? So very little of that time is actually spent on education. So Jazakallah khairan, just for emphasizing that point, because I'm sure this is something people are thinking, wait a minute, that's not fair, 8-1. Well, like you said, it's also about quality, right? Yeah. The third prerequisite then, or the third thing that you need to have, right, as a qualification, is that you need to have a home that's based on education. You need to have a home that is based on education, right? Now, what I mean by that is not like desks and chairs and, right? You can have fun and learn too. So like even the types of games that you bring into the household, right? That these are educational games, right? The type of screen time, which you should try to limit as much as you can, that it's beneficial, right? So one mantra that I give to parents is books instead of screens, right? If a child gets bored and all they see around them is books, then that kind of becomes their norm, right? And part of that, of course, is you being a good example in reading these books, right? Whether it's the Quran, whether it's something related to the deen, or, something related to improving yourself, in this life, or a secular subject, that when they see these books around the house, right, it becomes just sort of a norm for them that, oh, I had books around the house. And subhanAllah, the legacy that will leave behind is immense, right? Just growing up around books. And for those of you who read a lot, I'm sure this is something that you can relate to. And the important thing as well is that it's important to start off on that track, right? Once your journey in parenthood begins, right? Because one thing that happens with a lot of parents is that they introduce a lot of unlimited screen time, TV shows, Netflix, iPad, right? And then all of a sudden now they're like, I want to start homeschooling. I can't do it because when we're around the home, all my kid wants to do is go on the iPad, right? So if you start off like this, really, it's so much easier if you start off like that. I remember this analogy that Ibn al-Jawzi, rahimahullah, gives, where he says that disciplining your child, just providing the correct tarbiyah, the correct discipline, the correct environment, starting the right routines at a young age, he compares to straightening a branch from a tree, right? It's very easy to do that. But disciplining your child when they become older is like trying to straighten the whole tree. It's so difficult to do that, right? And this, just this principle alone, which Ibn al-Jawzi wrote about more than 800 years ago, just this principle alone, right? And we see it from the Sunnah of the Prophet more than 1400 years ago, right? Just this principle alone will fix so many of the parenting challenges that we have, of just starting off correct and making sure that your home is set up for learning to begin with, right? The fourth thing then is making sure that you have a willing English-speaking parent. If you're homeschooling, in an English-speaking medium country, that is willing to stay a few steps ahead of the child. The reason that I say this is that it doesn't mean that you have to be an educator as a profession. You don't need to be a professional educator. Now, again, that might take some people back, right? Now, I was a former teacher, and I'm not too proud to admit that there's some terrible teachers out there. And I know because I taught right next to them, right? And you'll see some things that'll really surprise you. I remember one teacher I worked with that would teach for 15 minutes and then just sort of hang out the rest of the time. And I remember asking him one time, I said, would you just hang out the rest of the time and not even require the students to like do homework or, go around helping them if that was your own children? And he was like, no, but that didn't change him. Right? This teacher is just teaching for 15 minutes and just leaving it to the class. Hey, y'all do what you want to do. Right. But the crazy thing is
but
that
I guess, a lot of teachers are underpaid and not, or kind of disgruntled at work. I don't want to stereotype, but I think that might be a factor into the equation, right?
I think that might be a factor in it as well.
Because a lot of these teachers are underpaid, and they're going and facing 30 kids in a classroom for hours on end. A lot of troublemakers.
Yep.
The impact that could have on the psyche of the teacher himself. We need to humanize the teacher here as well, right? And imagine that you're sending your child to be around this individual for the
Mhm.
entire day. Well, this individual is not a robot, right? So he's
He's a
going to
human.
be making
He's a human.
mistakes, and he's going to be influencing
Yeah.
your child, right?
Yep. Yep. And I appreciate you humanizing teachers, and I'll also say that some of the teachers don't even just some of the teachers really don't have your child's best interest in mind. And yes, this might be connected to them being, underpaid. And I've seen it, right in front of my eyes where, the level of care that some teachers have towards the students is, based on who they relate to the most. Right now, there's a reality in that too, right? Where I've seen, for example, some teachers, if the student is the teacher's ethnicity or race,
Mm,
right? All of a sudden, they're willing to give that student extra time. They
mm,
see them as their own child. And
mm,
then when it's a Muslim child, it's like, oh, maybe they have home problems, right? And
mm,
this is something that I was shocked that I would see that so directly. And it's not something that perhaps they're like knowingly doing, right? And it's one of those things that we have to just check ourselves on constantly, which Alhamdulillah Islam encourages, right? To constantly be taking account of yourself and looking at your motivations and your actions, right? So the reason that I say staying just a few steps ahead is that you don't have to know everything about teaching. You don't have
mm,
to know everything about about the content, right? But it has to be that you're willing to just stay ahead, right? And the reason that I say that is because you can't be an expert in every field. And ultimately, a goal when it comes to homeschooling is to create an independent learner, right? And I think this will be a goal for a lot of parents. Who wouldn't want this? A child who is individually, internally, intrinsically motivated, right? And knows the resources that they can access to get accurate information, right? It doesn't always have to come back to the teacher, right? And this is something that is really important, especially in this day and age where everything is available. Right now, there's some practical skills that need supervision, right? That need to be supervised in the way that they're learned, right? So that bad habits don't start there,
mm.
right? But I'll give you an example like coding. You know, uh, there's so many resources out there that it's overwhelming. Someone can learn how to code for free, right? And if this is something that is instilled in the child of trying to be an independent learner from the beginning, this can be something that later on when they, as they get into middle school or high school, that they can learn on their own, right? Now, another important thing here is that many people who are not teachers by profession think that I can't teach because it's not my profession, but they don't realize how many transferable skills there are, right? I remember one time I was talking to a friend of mine who's a doctor, and he's like, "I don't think I could do it. I'm not a teacher, right?" And I'm like, "You're a doctor. Like, you are talking to patients and explaining things to them that have, critical consequences if they misunderstand, right? When it comes to education, if I make a mistake in teaching, I can go and correct it the next day. No one dies, right? No one, no one dies. I was just reading from a homeschooling author yesterday. She said there's no homeschooling emergencies, right? So this pressure that parents put on themselves that like this has to be at this exact moment, it's not there, right? It's something that we're creating in our own minds,
Yeah,
right?
I mean,
So,
sometimes I see people saying this,
mhm,
yet when they send their kids to school and their school
yeah,
comes and their kid comes back to school, they teach their kids. They
I,
revise their homework with them. So I'm like, wait, what are you
yeah,
doing? You're already teaching them, man. Like
look at that, look at
you're
that, yeah,
yeah, like when your kid comes back to school, you're not only saying okay, maybe some parents are like that, but you don't have a complete hands-off approach. You're asking your kid, so what do you learn today?
no,
Show me your homework. Did you
yeah,
do your homework? Can I see what you did?
mhm,
You skim through his book, you flip through his book, you help him prepare for exams. So
yeah,
you're kind of already doing that, right? But it's just that they have that little reassurance that at least he learned something at
yep,
school, and I'm just there to like
yeah,
compliment. But if you really think about it, a lot of the times you actually do understand
you
what your kid
actually
learned,
are doing it,
and you actually help him revise, and
yeah,
you teach him to it properly if he's struggling to understand what he learned at school,
mhm,
right? And not everyone can afford a tutor, so
yeah, you
sometimes
might,
you do find yourself forced to teach your kid. So just
mhm,
transfer that motivation to the homeschooling context, and just do it.
yeah. Right. And then, another really important point there is that I like what you said, is that you're already doing it. Is that if you were to, you know, if you were to like reduce the harms of public schooling as much as you can, this would mean that you're doing the things that you're doing. You're asking, hey, what'd you learn today? What's it like praying at school, right? Are you able to pray at school? Are they giving you problems when it comes to that? Did you see anything you want to talk about? And the interesting thing is that having all of those conversations, right, and like actually having those conversations the way they should be held, right, and all the support of like the nagging, getting ready for school and all of that, right, that might actually take more time more time from you than homeschooling would have, right? Like the deprogramming that you have to do and the getting ready and the doing, it might just be the same amount of time that you would have spent homeschooling, right? So for example, in my family, homeschooling, the secular subjects, I would say on average, you probably spend about an hour and a half a day. And it's definitely not every day, 4 or 5 days a week, right? And I'm thinking about, if I were to like drop my kids off at school, go and pick them up, right? Talk to them afterward, help them with their homework. Might just be the same amount of time, right?
Exactly. If not more. If not more.
Yeah, if not more. And then another thing that's related to that as well is that a good, don't put yourself down on your ability to educate, because guess what? A good parent is a good educator. Right. So if you're like, oh, I don't think I can teach, well, okay, then you can't parent. Right. Because think about, teaching values, teaching routines to your child, right? This is education too. In fact, this is the most important form of education. Right now, if you can't explain that, right, if you can't have that discussion with your child, then you need to work on your parenting skills. And we'll talk about some resources to help with that later on. But a good educator is a good parent, and a good parent is a good educator, right? So don't put yourself down like that, right? The other thing that you're teaching your child, as you go on this journey, is that it's okay to not know something, right? It's okay to, be somewhere that you're not necessarily happy with at the moment, right? And that if you work hard at it, right, you can get better. These are the type of skills, like this idea of having a growth mindset, of willing to expand your knowledge, of willing to, take a calculated risk. These are all important moves for the child to see modeled by the parent as well, right? The fifth thing is having a willing student, right? Now, it's easiest to start while they're young, right? When a child is young, and just make that a norm from the beginning, right? And this is my recommendation, to start while they're young. Now, there's all sorts of conversations about like, well, if you're going to...
Sorry to interrupt you, but I think it would also be easier for the parent, because because it'll be a piece of cake, it'll be a cakewalk, you teaching your kid grade 1 and grade 2, grade 3, like that'll be easier for you. Grade 10 and 11 and 12, like it'll even be hard for me to remember that stuff, right?
But of course.
Long as if you're getting yourself used to relearning things that you learned at school, and you're starting from grade 1 yourself, and you're growing with your child, it'll be easier than starting off from high school, right? So sorry to interrupt you. I just want to like emphasize that.
No. I really appreciate you bringing up that point, because it connects to another point, right? And which is, I like what you said right now, me relearning because I forgot, right? Now, as a parent educator, right, you realize the things that are truly valuable because you see them in your profession, you see them in your day-to-day, right? So you can emphasize the things that are truly valuable, right? So you think about, the things you've learned in school that you're like, well, I don't think this is actually important. Well, in most cases, you don't have to actually teach that specific thing.
Yeah.
For example, think about like Greek mythology. I really don't care if my kids know a whole lot about Greek mythology. I want them to know that it was shirk, right? As a Muslim, I'm not going to be like testing them, like, who is Zeus? And who is he the son?
It's not going to come in the GMAT, entry exam for
Right. And subhanAllah, this is a really important thing for us to realize, is that, in some ways, like you having your own career, or just, being an adult, right? You realize the things that really are important in day to day, and you can focus on those things. Because think about all the things that are important that are not taught. I remember as an adult, like an independent adult, I didn't know how to write a check, right? And I had to Google it, right? And it's just like, you'd think they would teach you this in school. It's such a valuable thing, right? But you see, when it comes to like money management, these typically are skills that are not taught, right? So having that willing student is really important. And now that also connects back to, of course, our first thing, which was to make sure that you know your why, right? Because we need to be able to explain to our child why, right? Our child, we don't need to wait until the child asks. And this is something that a lot of Muslim parents shy away from, is that your child can handle a lot of conversations that you think they can't handle, right? And the more you explain that to them, the more you talk to them as an adult now, the more you'll have a bond with them where there's more trust built between you, right? Because if you're always hiding things from them out of thinking, oh, they're not ready for that, right? Then it can actually breed some trust issues, later on, right? So being able to talk to your children like they're adults, somewhat, and according to, whatever is age appropriate, your child best, right? There's no reason to hide while you're homeschooling, right? And you can share with them some of the benefits that are in it for them. For example, flexibility, pursuing their own interests, pursuing their own hobby, right? It can be, for example, that you guys negotiate on, not starting super early in the morning, right? Or how about traveling, right? How about, doing more of the preferred activities? Perhaps it's a sport that your child likes playing. Well, how about now, we put you on this team and you can play this sport now, and not be so tired by the time you get there because you were, being transferred from one room to another for 8 hours, right? So this is another really important thing that you need to have in order to homeschool. A willing student. We are on number six, right? Which is having a healthy relationship with your child. Again, we'll talk about some resources for that later on. But, right now, this is something that has to be fixed before you're homeschooling, right? If you have the type of relationship with your child where you're just like constantly nagging and they don't respect you, right? Well, this is something you have to fix. Now, here's the thing, whether you homeschool or not, you still have to fix this.
Regardless.
You have to fix this regardless. So, get to it. Like, this is something that it's never too late to fix. But of course, just like the analogy the comparison we gave, it's better to start while they're young, right? Of, having the type of relationship with the child where, it's not constant nagging all the time, right? Where the child understands the reason why they need to do certain things. And the child doesn't have to, have things constantly repeated to them. And again, we'll give some resources for that later on. The seventh practical requirement is to have knowledge of your own state requirements. Of course, you need to know wherever you live, well, what are the actual requirements? Now, make sure you join some sort of group, right, that you at least communicate with, or that you can, ask questions to regarding specific requirements. Because there's some things, whenever laws are written, some things that are very fuzzy, some things that are unclear, perhaps even when it comes to testing, deciding the best, most accurate and flexible type of testing. The eighth thing is that you need to have a willingness to explore resources, right? That your homeschooling is an overwhelming world, right? With just so much information, right? You need to be willing to explore resources. You need to be willing to just say, hey, let me learn more about this resource, right? And what this is doing is that you're modeling for the child how to be resourceful, right? Your child sees that, okay, maybe I don't know this, let me seek this knowledge. Let me try to get this information from elsewhere, right? Now, the ninth thing, if you've been counting, is keeping and having a plan, which again goes back to number one, is knowing the why. Because if you know the why, you know your plan. Now, the plan doesn't have to be the super written out, lesson plan. I will tell you, by the way, teachers don't really care about lesson plans. A lot of teachers, honestly, this is just something we do to, get high marks, when we're doing the practicum. After that, right, a good teacher is not always like, okay, oh no, but I didn't have the objective and the specific minutes for how long each activity would be. And of course, a lot of that goes back to the point we were talking about class size, right? There's a lot of flexibility when it's just 1-on-1 or 2-on-1, right? So you need to have some sort of plan. It doesn't have to be very, very, very detailed, in the beginning, right? And I think that this is important in order to not overwhelm parents. Just make a little bit of progress a day, right? And if you do that, you'll be in a totally different place by next year, right? If you can just plan, know your next immediate steps, right? It doesn't, for example, I talk to parents whose children are in kindergarten and they're like, yeah, but how do they graduate homeschooling? It's like, whoa, relax. We just, that escalated very quickly. That was 13 years that that went by really quickly. Perhaps your child will absolutely refuse homeschooling by like 9th grade. Well, what are you going to do then, right? When they're bigger than you and stronger than you, you tried everything, right? Now what are you going to do, right? Well, now you have something that, you need to talk about with your child. Maybe there's, maybe there's a place there where you need to negotiate, right? Because guess what? If they hit puberty at that time, they're an adult, right? You do need to give them a little bit of wiggle room to gradually make their own decisions, right? And then the last thing, and this also connects back to the first point, is financial stability, right? Is that homeschooling ultimately requires one parent, at least one parent can give that time. And this requires some sort of financial stability. Now, when I say financial stability, I'm not talking about the American dream of, the white picket fence and, all of that. I'm talking about, are you able to provide for your basic needs while homeschooling? Right. And this is something that, depending on where you are, the cost of it differs, right? But you need to be able to take time away from that in order to give your child time. Right. Now, homeschooling is something that is growing. There's a lot of interest in it now, and it's only been going up every year, the number of parents that are homeschooling. Another thing that is going to increase the number of homeschoolers out there is all the jobs now going remote. Not everything, but many jobs, right, going remote. Is that this will give more time to parents. This will give parents an opportunity to, plan their day and structure their day the way that they would like. Right. So even now, perhaps some parents who are working full time, depending on their career, will actually have the ability to homeschool. And this is only going to increase the number of homeschoolers. Right now, again, when we think about financial stability, don't let your children be a fitna for you. And always remember that point, that your children are not going to remember the money that you spent on them. Right. They're going to remember the time that you spent with them. Right. And for, depending on what community you come from, right, there's a lot of people who also have responsibilities of sending money back home. Right. So, for example, me, I'm from Somalia, and this is every Somali family sends money back home. Every month they're sending money back home. Every Somali family is doing it, right? Differing amounts, but, there's people in the family that are sending money back home. Right. So I think a critical conversation that needs to have in communities like that, where that is sort of the expectation, is how can you have both, but without compromising the tarbiyah or the upbringing of your own children, right? Because you need to, yes, it's a requirement, to support your family back home. This is part of having, Silatul Rahim, with your family. But at the same time, connecting the ties and maintaining family ties. At the same time, you can't do that at the cost of you losing your own children in the public school system, right? Because again, you're going to be asked about this. Everyone will be asked about their responsibilities and those under their care. So those are
where there's a will, there's a way. Inshallah ta'ala,
there's a will, there's a way.
We can't speak to everyone's needs. Barakallahu fikum for that, very comprehensive response. What about those who would say, but look, my kid is really going to get bored staying at home all day. Like he deserves to have some fun and go to school and play with friends and whatnot. Like homeschooling is really boring for the kid. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's pretty unfair, because, homeschooling is what you make it, right? So you can make it fun. Ideally, a homeschooling student should have more fun, right? Because, they're having a greater say, and it is important to give your children some sort of a say in their preferred activities, right? Where they can, design their own opportunities, their own projects, right? So I'll give an example. One of my kids, we saw that she was interested in making bracelets. Right. So, yes, it seems like, maybe something that every girl goes through, like, oh, I like this arts and crafts and I want to continue doing it. Right. Well, what we did with her is that we had her create a business. Right. And what that meant is that she now had the opportunity to increase her social skills by speaking to people who wanted to buy her product. Right. It meant that now she had the practice and the capability to organize and devise a business plan, right, that she could execute. It meant that now she has something that she can explore, it's just exploring, right, no commitments, as a future home-based career, right? Now, people look at that, they're like, wait, career? Yeah, there's millionaires on Etsy making bracelets, right? And, I think that especially when it comes to immigrant parents, right, is that we really have to, think more, we really have to think broader, right, when it comes to what we want for our children. Number one is that ultimately it is your child's choice. So parents need to stop, forcing their children, I want you to become this career. You have to become a doctor. You have to become an engineer. I mean, this is extreme, right? I know of a situation where, a person almost got cut off, by their family because they became a pharmacist instead of a physician, right?
Okay.
And it just like tore, this, child's relationship with their parents, right? And it's like, subhanallah, like, come on, right? At the end of the day, the most important thing for us is that we have a child that makes dua for us after our death, right? What's more important than that? And this is part of the deeds that will continue. Waladin salih yad'u lah, right? A righteous child that will, make dua for you. This is what we hope Allah Azza wa Jal will give us, right? Now, what will it do for you? Your child became a physician, but they don't make dua for you. How did that help you? Right? So this is the most important thing, right? In terms of, the career that we want for our children, is that whatever career they have, that it allows them to be connected to Allah Azza wa Jal, and that it's not a career that compromises their deen, and it's a career that allows them to prioritize their family. Ultimately, that's what we want, regardless of the career. Now, the reason that I bring that up is that I also I hope in my discussions with parents, and me mentioning, some of my previous experiences. So, for example, as a college counselor, I did a lot of career coaching, right? And I think that, as parents, we need to realize that college is not a requirement for everyone, right? And it's a case-by-case situation where parents need to weigh the pros and cons. Now, I know someone might hear this and think, this religious brother who's not, academically ambitious or whatever, no, I am academically ambitious. I have a master's degree. And education is important to me, and it's important to my children. I come from a family of, people who are educated, in terms of that aspect, in terms of having gone to college. And that's something that's important to me. But it's not something that's for everyone, right? So, for example, we have a lot of young Muslims, right, who are going into college, right? And they're being forced to pursue a certain thing, but they're not actually ready for college because they don't know yet what they want to do. So they end up just hanging out. And some of them are losing their status as students. Some of them are losing, perhaps, if they were a lower income family, the aid they would have gotten from the government. Now they're losing that. Their financial aid suspension, and what's the other one? Academic probation, right? From the university suspending them because they're not doing well, right? We need to be flexible in terms of how we think about career opportunities for our children. I know someone who makes more than $100 an hour detailing cars, right? Now, if he enjoys that, why as a parent are you upset about the type of work your child is doing, right? If, it provides for their family, they can actually become wealthy from it, right? You think about, all these jobs and the trades. It's not a matter of not being ambitious academically. It's a matter of being practical. Right. There are a lot of people out there with very advanced degrees that are not working in those fields or that couldn't find work with them. Right now, yeah, you get to walk around and say, my child is this, my child is that. But, bills still got to be paid. Right. And, ultimately, you have to be in a career that you love. Some of these careers are too difficult to get into if you don't like it. You can't get into medicine if you don't like it. Like that's a whole life commitment. You're delaying everything in your life in order to get into medicine. Right. So these are all really important things that we have to think about in terms of careers for our children. Again, coming from a career coach, who has worked with, dozens and dozens of students, when it comes to this, perhaps hundreds. And, understanding that homeschooling, allows your child to not only explore and not only to have fun, but to explore their genuine interests, right? The public school system, it's amazing how many students I talk to. 12th grade, right? I don't know what I want to do. Well, I mean, that's a failure, right, of a public school system, right? If you've been in this system for that long and you still have no idea, like, what you're interested in, right? To me, that's highly problematic. And part of that is just a result of the one-size-fits-all approach and not being allowed to pursue your own interests. So, you can have your child in the activities they like, whether it's swimming, basketball, arts and crafts, whatever it might be. Nothing stops you from doing that, right? Yeah.
Oh, how would you respond to someone who says that, resorting to homeschooling is just being overly restrictive? I could send my kid to public school and I could have, these chit chats with him. I could send him to some Islamic summer camp, or I could send him to the masjid or Muslim community activities during the weekend. We don't have to resort to homeschooling. This is becoming overly restrictive right now.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that claim?
Well, my internal thought sometimes I I kind of want to laugh, right? And I know that seems terrible, but I want parents to visualize this, right? That you're saying that homeschooling is restrictive, and you're wanting them to be in an environment where they have to sit in this chair, not any chair, this chair, and that they have to raise their hand, right, to go use the bathroom, right? And that they have to wait until a bell rings to get up and go to their next class. And that they're being restricted, every minute of the day,
For three
right?
quarters of the
And
day. Yeah. For a third
every
of the day,
minute of
sorry,
the
for a
day.
third of the day.
Yeah, a third of the day, a full school day, right? And they're being limited and restricted in every way. And you think homeschooling is strict? Come on. What's really strict is the public school system. And in fact, a lot of educators have said that it really resembles prison
Hmm.
in a lot of ways. In a lot of ways, that how restrictive it is, right? And that's scary, right?
Hmm.
It's actually very scary how much restriction there is, and the fact that students are also collectively punished, right? In schools. I was at a school where we had one fight one time, and I remember from that point on, every a child could not use the bathroom without an escort. You have to call for an escort, right? And then
Oh, wow.
security escort them to use the bathroom. This isn't like a one school sort of situation. This is, in terms of, giving consequences for everybody based on the actions of two people, right? This is something that's very common in schools, especially in the public school system, right? So homeschooling really is what's flexible, right? In terms of, the child gets to take a part in their education, right? And gets to do preferred activities that they enjoy, right? And they don't have to have every minute of their lives structured out for them. And I think this is also a note for parents who want to mimic the public school system. Is there's nothing to mimic. It's
Hmm.
not successful. If it were
Hmm.
successful, yeah, then mimic it, right?
Hmm.
But it's not that it's very successful either. So there's really no reason to mimic this system. And this is where a lot of parents fail with homeschooling, is that they want to do this 7 hours a day. Again,
Hmm.
it's about quality. It's not about quantity, right? And it also doesn't actually fit in with the developmental ages of children. I would say that the public school system kind of caters more to girls than it does to boys, right? I think about, your average 6-year-old boy, right, who's attending kindergarten. Your average 6-year-old boy has a tough time sitting for 45 minutes, right? But now this is forced on them, right? Where they're not even allowed to play. SubhanAllah, they make horseplay seem like a sin.
Hmm.
For kids in the education system, these kids are just wrestling for a moment. Break it out, it's absolutely nuts. Ibn al-Jawzi rahimahullah, he says that this horseplay and this aggressiveness that children can sometimes have with each other, that it's actually a sign of intelligence, right? But here it's treated like a disease in the public school system, right? So you're putting them in this environment that is the definition of being too restrictive. And not to mention all the other issues that we mentioned earlier in terms of values and
Exactly. Yeah. Well
and
said.
peer influence.
Well said.
Yeah.
Well said. So, I mean, here now, this is probably the number one objection I see to
Hmm.
homeschooling. All right.
Yeah.
And that is the homeschooled child is highly susceptible to becoming socially awkward. So, if you homeschool and keep your kids away from an
Hmm.
actual public or private school where he could interact with other kids as all other regular kids do, then your kid's
Yeah.
social skills will become compromised. So, how would you address that concern? I think that's like the number one concern
Yes,
that I personally always see being raised.
I've heard this concern a lot, and there's a couple of things here that are very ironic. One of them is that there's a lot of public school kids that are very awkward, right? Is that going to public school doesn't necessarily make you less awkward. So that's one, right? The second thing is that homeschooling is what you make it, right? So you can have your child socially interact in all sorts of extracurricular activities. You can teach your child a lot of leadership even, right? Just by, again, being more flexible in terms and being more flexible in terms of activities, right? And doing, this project-based learning, right? Where, your child not only knows how to talk with other people, but knows how to get things done, right? So, homeschooling is what you make it. If this is important to you, right, you can make sure that you build in a lot of opportunities for social interaction with other children. However, I'll also say this, right, and I really invite the viewers to really think about this, right? What do we mean by being socially awkward, right? And think about, when it comes to fitting in, right, with other kids, their age in the public school system, is that how would you define a child who's not socially awkward, right? Would it be the child who fits in with everyone because he does what everyone else is doing? Because if that's the case, then do we really want that for our Muslim children, right? There's going to be an element of being socially awkward with, being a virgin, right? That's socially awkward, especially in a society that doesn't see that as something valuable,
Yeah,
right?
according to whose standards, right? According to whose
Yeah,
standards?
according to standards, right? So, for
In
our,
a corrupt society, you as a Muslim would
yeah,
want to be countercultural, right? If you're living in a
absolutely,
corrupt society, and that would be viewed as awkward and socially awkward.
absolutely. فطوبى للغرباء, right? You would be a stranger, right? And that time is now, where we see that being a Muslim is strange, right? And the Prophet ﷺ gave glad tidings to the strangers, right? To be that, like for example, I remember telling coworkers I don't listen to music, and their mind was blown, right? And for them to imagine that like Muslims can have fun without alcohol, right? It's just, these things blow their mind, right? Or that I feel, uncomfortable going to social gatherings where men and women are, sitting right next to each other, right? It's like these things are socially awkward. So, I like the way you phrased it, that in a corrupt society, then, whose view of socially awkward are we following? And then the last thing that I would say is that uh, this idea of socially awkward, a very ironic thing about it is that it's very limited in its definition, is that people only interpret being socially awkward when it comes to kids interacting with other kids, right? I would say that almost every public school kid is socially awkward when interacting with adults, right? You ask them, how are you doing? Good. What's new? Nothing, right? And it's like, well, if that's the average kid, response, right? Isn't that socially awkward? Or is socially awkward only pertaining to their interactions with other children, right? Now, this is a really important thing to think about. What I've seen, in my own experiences, is that homeschooled kids, even the ones that are socially awkward with their peers, are very emotionally intelligent and are very well mannered when it comes to interacting with adults. But here's the thing: you're going to be an adult more than you're a kid if you live an average
Yeah, exactly.
lifespan, right? So it's very fascinating to me that socially awkward has this limited definition, that it's only about kids interacting with other kids. I've also seen in my own personal experiences parents who started homeschooling, started some sort of home education, and then their child started attending public school, and they were very shocked at the change in mannerisms of the child, where the child's attention span went lower. The child started, sharing inappropriate jokes, no longer had an interest. The child struggled with like having serious conversations that they saw as a possibility before, right? And I think about, for example, right now, one thing that's common in the public school system is getting kids to read by any means necessary, even if that means introducing them to books that are just about like farting, right? So a lot of boys, in first, second grade will be introduced to books like Captain Underpants, where it's like, it's just ridiculous, right? It's just so immature, right? And yes, they're young, right? I get that. But at the same time, like now your kid who you could have somewhat serious conversations with just tells fart jokes, right? It's like, is that what we mean by not being socially awkward,
And I think but maybe just to go back to the question, because I think maybe ultimately parents are genuinely concerned about their children having friends, right? How are they going to make friends? Where are they going to make friends if not at school, right? And and I think a common response that homeschoolers give is that, look, wherever you are, it's very likely the case that you're going to find other homeschoolers, right? There's always a network of homeschoolers in some major metropolitan city that you're living in, and it's not only in the West; it could be even the Middle East or whatnot. And these will be parents who are like-minded, and it will be very likely be the case that they might have children at the age of your children as well, and they could become friends
Yeah.
together, right? And then they could go out and do homeschooling activities like nature walks or whatever, right? So,
Yeah.
so the idea here is that because we don't, I guess maybe some of the viewers might get the impression that, oh, so are you guys trying to say that as a homeschool child, my I'm gonna be my kid's only friend, right?
Oh
I
my.
guess, yeah. So it's all mine, right? So maybe that's the concern that they're getting, right? So it's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
impossible for them to have friends, right?
Absolutely. It's not impossible at all. And there's you remind me of this funny conversation I had one time when I was working in clinical lab science, which is like a very sort of like nerdy field. And I remember one time the supervisor calling out one of the employees, by name and saying, listen, this was at a meeting. You cannot make your emergency contact someone your mom that lives in Texas.
Oh,
Right.
okay.
And I just had like this moment of like deep sadness where I'm just like, the only person that cares about you is like that far away. Like I live in northern US, like that. That's absolutely wild, right? So you can go to public school and be, that person who doesn't have friends. Not to mention issues related to bullying, right? And echoing off the point that you brought up about viewers' concerns is that it's not that homeschooling is like I'm going to restrict my child on everything, right? It's that you're giving your child a gradual release of responsibilities where where you give them freedom gradually, and once they finally do have that freedom, right, then they have that upbringing, that past experience, that past education, that past experience with values, and you modeling things for them where they make the right decision. They're going to be independent eventually, right? And with public school, there's all these interactions that you don't have any sort of say in, right? Well, with homeschooling, you can introduce them to good friends, right? And make that kind of the only option in the beginning, right? Now later on, of course, that that child is going to be their own person and make their own friends, right? But at least if you can introduce them to a good network, right? This is a responsibility, that you have as a parent. So no, we're not saying that you're going to be your child's best friend, just you two, right? But that this gives you
Nothing
more
wrong being his
control.
best friend, but not his only friend, right? He can
Only
be
that, like
friends with
me and my
children
dad.
his
That's
age.
it.
Yeah, yeah. So,
Absolutely. Yeah.
so a lot of people ask, like, shouldn't my child experience the real world? Why create this protective bubble
Mhm.
for him? Eventually,
Yeah.
like you said, he's going to step
Mhm.
into the real world. So better
Yep.
prepare him for it sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's truth to that, right? Where your child doesn't need to be prepared for the real world. However, what's important is that I invite parents to think about what does the real world have? So, for example, the real world has bullying. The real world has drugs. The real world has prostitution, pornography. Like the real world has a lot of crazy things. Right now, does this mean you're never going to expose your child to the real world? No, that'll come. Eventually, that'll come. Your child is going to be independent. They're going to start to make their own decisions. Right now, when that happens, you want to trust that you gave them the right tools, right, to handle that, right, in a way that's pleasing to Allah, right? And that's what you're trying to ingrain in your children, right? You're trying to have these conversations later on that they can later look back and reflect on, right? So yes, we want to prepare them for the real world, and the real world has all of these things, but why force them to be exposed to everything, right away, which is what is happening in the public school system, right? Where right away your child is now exposed to all of this, right? So for example, a question we might ask back is, so when do you think is the first time a child should hear swearing? Well, in the public school system, they'll hear it in their first week of school, right, from another child, right? Well, do they have to? Like, is that the best time? Or do you want to maybe for your child to hear that later on, right? When you feel like they have a better understanding of what good speech is, as the Prophet ﷺ said. Yeah.
Okay, let's speak finances now. So, how much does homeschooling cost? If
How much
it,
does it cost? Well,
just,
I we have a family of four, and we homeschool the three oldest ones right now. Our last child is just too young for homeschooling right now. And I would say last year, I think we spent about $250 altogether on homeschooling.
for all
Um,
four children.
for all of them. Yep, for all
Mashallah.
of them together. And this is the older three, not the fourth one, because you can actually reuse, a lot of material, right? You can share material, you can get discounted material, right? And some districts will actually also provide some help. So our district can help you up to $80, right? So you can ask the district directly, when you fill out paperwork to the district. Our district helps you up to $80, which actually goes a long way. $80 per child goes a long way. So for example, the annual test that students are required to do in our state is $20 per student, right? And it's just reading and math, and it's like very basic. Again, the standards, especially in the American school system, are very low. So it's very easy to pass, right? And then you have, the prices of books, extracurricular activities that you want your child to participate in. So for example, our oldest is going to be starting like the sewing class, and she's really excited about it because it's something that she really enjoys. And that's I think it's gonna cost something like $50, right? So there was like this discounted program that she could get in. So altogether, I was reading recent data that the average homeschooling parent in the US spends $600 a year per student, right? So and I think that's because a lot of homeschoolers are like these super wealthy, families. We don't really have that to spend, like our family in particular, but it hasn't really limited us, right? We're still able to take advantage of all these free opportunities. You'd be surprised all of these free educational opportunities that exist out there. And one thing that's really cool is that as a homeschooler, you have unlimited access to all of these things that other kids that are not going to be crowded, right? So other kids will be there, but it's not going to be crowded, like you went there on a weekend. So for example, exploring your science museum, exploring your history museum, right? You can do all of these things on a budget, right? Even when it comes to traveling, we do travel, not a lot. In our last bigger vacation, we went to Egypt, and it was really just this beautiful adventure, really, for the kids, because prepping up to it. And while we were there, we were reading about the story of Musa alayhi salam, right? So just being able to see that, oh, that's the Nile, right? That's the river that he was put in as a child, right? To be able to travel to these different places, these are, the pyramids. This is what, Fir'aun, who claimed to be Allah, this is what his people built, right? But, alhamdulillah, now Islam prevailed over that area. To give them this Islamic worldview is something that we're capable of doing without really spending a whole lot. Right now, again, it goes back to that question of, the why of, if your why, spending, $200,
it's secondary now. Yeah, it's a peripheral thing. Yeah.
Right? You're spending that on subscriptions, to random things, right? Yeah.
Or think about all the gasoline that you're gonna have to purchase driving kids to and back from school, right?
Right. And some parents are doing a whole, crossing crazy distances just to take their kids to a better school, right? So you think about all of that,
or buy all the luxury branded clothes that your kids want you to buy so they could show off at school and impress their friends, right? And the nice coolest backpack and sports shoes so they could show off their friends. Yeah, it might be costlier sending them to public school.
That's a good point. Yeah, I can definitely, understand when it comes to that point. I remember one of my students one time, he was wearing these pants that are called True Religion, right? And I'm just like, man, that's kind of just opposes Islam in some ways, right? And it had a little Buddha, right? I was like, what is this? He told me that these pants costed him $300, and I'm like, that is crazy. Where do you work at? I need to I need to get out of education, figure out what you're doing. SubhanAllah.
So when we spoke earlier about the importance of making time, that parents should make time for homeschooling, but maybe we could talk a little bit about how parents can make time. Are there any practical suggestions in that arena, or is it just general time management advice that we could give?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of general time management advice, but then, some of it's specific to education, right? So what's really important in education, is gradual progression, and, having students be able to consume material and being able to explain it, right? Now, the reason that I say that is because when you think about that as an educator, right? And these are things our scholars have talked about years ago. For example, Ibn al-Qayyim, rahimahullah, talks about the stages of knowledge, right? So like the highest stage, he considers to be teaching a concept, right? So you think about it like this is, so long ago, right? That our scholars, have already addressed these topics, right? If you think about it from that perspective, right, it really allows you to structure time better, right? So one of the ways in which you can do that are by spacing apart, how having the right increments, right, when it comes to learning. And this allows you to get to know your child more, right? So for example, going back to what we talked about, some parents will be like, okay, it needs to be just like school. No, that is a bad idea. What I recommend is something more of like the Pomodoro technique where which works for professionals as well, where basically you set a timer, you work on a task for about 25 minutes, and you set a timer for 5 minutes, right? And that time is to take your break. And you get back into it for 30 minutes, take a timer, and, doing a relaxed activity for 5 minutes, right? And then just making sure that, while you're doing this, right, that you're prioritizing gradual progress, right? That it doesn't have to be that everything is perfect day one, right? This can be something that's incremental, right? So, think of it as like improving attention span of a child, right? Basically by, starting off really small, right? With maybe your child's attention span is 5 minutes, 10 minutes, as we talked about earlier, you can learn a lot in 5 minutes. You can learn a lot in 5 minutes, right? If you, subhanallah, right? Like right now, I'm still studying myself, I still, I'm enrolled in an Arabic program, and I think about what I can accomplish in 5 minutes a day as a busy professional, and I can accomplish a lot in 5 minutes a day. And what I've noticed is that with children, their memorization skills are so much stronger that they can accomplish so much more, right, in that 5 minutes, just for example by listening. Like the simple act, for example, of just turning on a slow reciting reciter for the Quran 5 minutes a day, and the difference that will make in your child's pronunciation, the difference that'll make in your child's, knowledge of tajweed, and how easy it'll be for them to recite the Quran later on. So basically start off in small amounts, and gradually work forward. As we learn from the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, the most beloved deeds to Allah are those that are small but consistent, are those that are consistent even if they're small, right? So just starting off small and trying to, take breaks and gradually work to that, and also making sure that it is something that is fun and enjoyable for both of you, right? For the educator, for the homeschooling educator, and for the child as well, right? Remember that we're building positive memories, right? This isn't, drill and grill, we want to build positive memories with our child. We want them to like learning, right? We want them to enjoy it, right? And we want this to not be the same as a public school environment.
MashaAllah. Earlier, we spoke about ideally the best time to start homeschooling is when your kid is young. But does that translate into there being no other appropriate time when to start homeschooling? Like, so let's say you have your Muslim parents that are cognizant of the concept of homeschooling now, are convinced by it, but their kid right now is in high school, right? Is it too late for them to start? Has that ship sailed, or is there always an appropriate time, or is there a what would you say about that? I mean, is it too late to start?
I think it's never too late to start, as long as you have those prerequisites, right? As long as you have, those things we talked about. For example, let's say you have a 10th grader and you want to homeschool, and they're just, like, nope, it's not going to happen, right? It does get to that point as a parent where it's like, all right, I could try to force this, but, let me compare, the maslaha to the mafsada. Let me compare the benefits to the harm here, right? And it might not be in your best interest to do that, right? That's just a reality, right? Now, there's other ways of harm reduction that you can do in this case, right? And it might be perhaps, putting your child into more Islamic programs, trying to focus on cultivating positive relationships with good friends, right? At that time, although it is going to be harder at that time than it's going to be when they're younger, right? So it's possible, right? But again, at that age, they really have to be willing, right? This can't just be something you force down your child's throat and they're 16 years old, right? Especially I think about, some of our viewers, perhaps they're, divorced, right? And they're a single parent, right? It's like, there's only so much control that you have, right? Especially when now, let's say, the other party wants to make it a custody issue, say that they're neglecting the children. Like there's all these external factors that you have to think about when it comes to that age. It really, really is better to start when they're young. Now, again, as we talked about, even when they're young, you want to explain to them why we're doing this, right? Your young child should have an understanding of, oh, this is why I'm being homeschooled, right? Like it shouldn't just be like, oh, I'm not going to talk about it, and I feel like this is where a lot of parents go wrong with their children, just hiding information from them, thinking that they can't handle it. You'd be surprised what children can handle. You would be surprised what children can handle. So just talking to them, trying to negotiate with them, trying to explore some of the benefits that they might like, right? Perhaps it might be sleeping in, more trips as a family, more time to their own. Maybe they want to make money. Maybe you can integrate, them working and what they're learning from, working and putting in more hours at work, at that age. Perhaps it can be more of an apprenticeship with a trusted Muslim business, right? That that can be a good example for them. Maybe they can learn a trade during that time, just exploring, being flexible, right? Being creative, being resourceful, but knowing that it does get to that age where you can't force them as well.
Yeah. You spoke earlier in the beginning about how parents need not, lose heart, and expect themselves to become these professional teachers, right? But at the same time, how can parents learn how to teach, right? Because at the end of the day, if they're going to homeschool their kids, they're going to have to be able to teach somehow,
Absolutely.
right? And it can't just be through natural intuition. So, is there anything that any direction that we could give, aspiring homeschooling parents?
Yeah. Yeah. I chuckled a little bit because I think a lot of people, just when it comes to parenting in general, think that it's something you don't have to learn, think that it is like this just natural intuition, and my argument is that even if there is a natural intuition, I think at this point it's been corrupted, right? By all the things we're exposed to, right, on a daily basis. All of these shows and movies we were exposed to when we were younger, it's had an impact on us, and that's the reality. The best way, as we turn back to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what his messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, that's the best way. Now there are some great resources that have managed to compile, okay, what are some key events and examples we can use from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's life in order to inspire us as educators. I'm going to recommend two options. One is a 4-part series. It's just 4 parts, each one is 1 hour, right? That you could listen to, honestly, you can listen to it over and over again. It's so good, right? And it's done by a brother, Sheikh Musa Richardson, who's a graduate from Al-Qura University in Mecca. And he spent about 10 years over there, American brother. And he does a really good job, I feel like, with really reassuring parents, right, as they go on any sort of educational journey, but also as parents, right? He just does a good job, giving this reassurance, but also connecting back to that why, right? Like one of the things that I loved about his talk is that he starts with talking about how rahma is the core, right, is the foundation of you as a parent and as an educator, right? And takes us through, all of these examples from the Quran and Sunnah. So that's a great example. I'll post it in a resource guide, which then we can just make it as part of the description, inshallah. And then by the way, that course is completely free. Another opportunity is the Muslim Parenting Skills Workshop by Brother Michael Abraham, who has actually been on this channel, conveniently so. And he does a great job. I think that is about 11 or 12. I think it's an 11 or 12 part series. And there are a lot of gems in there that you can learn as a parent. Now, one thing that I think is also really important for the younger viewers that are listening, and I do this in our own IEC, in my education and coaching institution, is that I make sure that young people are introduced to these ideas about parenting, that young people are introduced to these ideas about raising children. And the reason why is because these actually have strong implications for who you're going to choose as a spouse, right? So, along with this, right, many people are figuring out parenting, right, after they become parents, right? And this is really something that you want to think about even before you become a parent, because this really informs who you're going to choose as a spouse. For example, you find as you're listening to this, you're like, man, homeschooling, I like that, right? Well, marry someone who also likes that. Otherwise, you're in for some conflict later on, right? And
yeah, send her this blogging theology episode and see what she thinks about it.
right there you go. That'll be like the test. That'll be the test. Do you agree with this? No, I'm just kidding, right? But these are big topics, right? And they are topics that, can produce conflict later on, right? So it's really important for even young people who are unmarried, right, to look into these topics and start learning about them now. And this is part of our responsibility as Muslims, right? That, you don't have to know everything about Islam, but whatever you get into, you should know about it, right? If you're going to be a business person, you should know about the fiqh and, the rulings related to business. If you're going to have children, know about, the rulings when it comes to having children. So those are two really good resources that I would recommend.
Inshallah, we'll share them in the description box below.
Inshallah.
I'll get the links off you later, inshallah ta'ala.
Perfect.
When it comes to choosing a curriculum, right? Sometimes I hear homeschoolers say, yeah, I'm going to choose the Singaporean curriculum because they're so good at math, right?
Yeah.
Is that the way one should be thinking, or should one be thinking, I want to choose the closest curriculum that children in my state and area are learning, but I'm going to filter the I'm going to filter the bad out, and then teach my kid the curriculum, in a way that I think is Islamically acceptable. What approach should take when it comes to how to choose or develop a homeschool curriculum for one's child?
I think this really connects back to what we talked about earlier about knowing your why, right? You really have a lot of flexibility, especially in the US, when it comes to homeschooling. So, for example, I live in Minnesota, and in Minnesota, your child is required to take a reading and math assessment that has been nationally normed, compared to other students once a year. And then you have to teach this list of subjects. I think it was like 14 subjects sometime before they graduate and assess them however you like, right? And it's like, whoa, that's a lot of flexibility, right? So how am I going to approach that? So it goes back to that why of why you want to homeschool, right? Because if why you want to homeschool is to instill a Islamic identity in your child, then that's number one for anything, right? That's number one for anything. And that's number one for your goals. Going back to what we said, your goal in raising children is to raise a child, that loves Islam, right? And that is internally motivated, right? That can, succeed on their own later on when they're independent, right? And someone that eventually makes dua for you, after your death, right? If you happen to, die before them, right? So all of this, the discussion about choosing a curriculum goes back to that. Right now, one thing that I want parents to think about is that when it comes to having a curriculum, that it's not only about, like book study and right, like secular subjects, right? If our focus is going to be, building that Islamic identity, and we want everything to stem off of that, right? Then one of the first things that we need to make sure that we're grounded in is our child's Islamic studies, right? Now, you can teach the best Islamic studies curriculum, but you have to be a model of that, right? You yourself have to actually act on that. You and your spouse, right, have to be. You got to be active. You can teach your child how to pray all day, right? If you're, hurried going through your prayers, right? You got to walk the walk. You can't just talk. Children will do what they saw from you, not what you said, right? So. In conversations about curriculum, I always talk about Islamic studies first, just to say, hey, these are the most important things that you want to do. Now, a real Islamic-based curriculum will take an Islamic approach to all of these topics, right? There's no perfect curriculum out there. However, there are some resources that I want to recommend, right? One of them is my first Islamic studies book, and that's the title. When I was a principal of an Islamic weekend school, one of the things that I was tasked with was just finding just a basic Islamic studies book that goes through everything, and is something that I can teach to a Muslim child, and that other teachers can teach. That's simple, that's colorful, and that isn't trying to like imitate a Western approach, but at the same time is something that students find captivating. So that's the title of the book, and it's printed by Markaz Mu'adh in the UK. Now, another important point when it comes to choosing an Islamic studies curriculum, after talking about being an example of that and, walking the walk, is that we really have to make sure when it comes to our Islamic studies curriculum that it's not something that, itself has contradictions, So, for example, like I see a lot of parents, want to introduce their kids to certain Islamic cartoons on YouTube, right? And then I watch it and I'm like, oh, this has like music in it, like actual music, and I'm just like, oh, that's kind of weird, right? It's like, I mean, the point, the views of scholars, arguing that musical instruments are haram are, there's a lot of strong evidence there, right? So you want to introduce your children, to things that you see as an example. Now because this is such a common thing that I get asked about, for example, when it comes to, cartoons, I always like to comment on it, and just say that children will oftentimes have a preference for the most exciting thing out of the options that you give them.
Yeah.
Right. So, your Islamic education for your kids, you don't want it to just come from cartoons, because then the cartoons will always be first, right? You don't want it to just come from nasheeds, because then that will always come first. That's always more entertaining to a child, right? A child will choose a nasheed over Quran typically, right? So, I didn't know how I felt about this until I had children, and I realized that like, if you introduce Quran to your child at a young age, they'll actually just like recite Quran as they're playing. Like they'll have all these surahs completely memorized, right? And it's something that they just enjoy, that they can't see themselves without. So that is, just a side point that I want to recommend to parents as well. Don't think that kids need to constantly be entertained, right? That thing that they enjoy can actually just be, when it comes to like, things that they listen to or things that they watch, it can be Quran, and it can be introducing them to books and having them have this love, this joy for reading. There's actually Islamic studies curriculums that you can buy. There's two resources that I would recommend for that. One is a home-based educator who also does a virtual Islamic school. Her name is Maymuna, and she has a lot of useful resources. And then another site is Salam Homeschooling. I think they do a really good job with providing some, free Islamic content that you can start kids off with. Now, once the kid is a fluent reader, there's even more opportunities. Because one thing that happens in the public education system is that there's this attempt to like infantilize kids, where it's like, oh, yeah, they're just kids, they can't handle that, right? And you find this even in the way teachers talk to students, where they'll avoid using big vocabulary because they think that, oh, this is too advanced for my child. But the reality of the matter is that whatever you expose to your child is what they're going to grasp. And if they're only exposed to low vocabulary, that's the only thing that they'll speak with, right? So, you can actually introduce them to the same sources that adults use, starting with the moment your child is now a fluent reader of English. And a great resource that you can add to your curriculum that's going to build their comprehension, build their knowledge of the Quran, and is simple to read, relatively simple for the child who's fluent in reading, is Imam Sa'di's tafsir, which has now been fully translated into English. And it's a great resource, honestly. It's not like a super difficult read. And again, the difficult words are things that we want them to grasp, right? And then, so that's another great resource. It is available for free online. I encourage buying it, of course, but it is available for free online. But buy it, support the publishers and buy it. I also recommend my own institution, IEC, for live Islamic studies and Quran courses. So they can check that out at ikared.com. And the way that we structure our courses are, again, focused on raising a child that loves Islam, right? And not just, drills and memorization, right? But focusing on comprehension, but of course, we're using authentic sources as well. With secular studies, the easiest way to get started with students who can already read, and I know this is going to be controversial, is with workbooks. The reason that I say that is because workbooks, are often based off of a curriculum already. So it gives parents the familiarity aspect, right? And often workbooks give a child practice and allow the parent to sort of get their own foothold, like when it comes to teaching, right? Of like, okay, I can read this on my own, right? See if I can explain it to the child, explain the exercise, and then have them, try it on their own. And one series that I really recommend, while no workbook series is perfect, is the Spectrum series, which you can find on Amazon, and they have all sorts of subjects. Now, again, this isn't like, this perfect solution, right? But it is, we're talking about just how to get started. And, I really advocate for a minimalist style, especially in the beginning, and not getting too advanced and just getting overwhelmed. Now, if your child cannot read, and by the way, the Spectrum series has workbooks on any secular topic that you can think of. If your child cannot read, the best way to teach a child to read is by using a phonics-based approach, which schools are also have drifted away from, and then now come back to, and then drift away from. It's like this, they just can't make up their minds. And the best way, the best source for that, in my experience, is the book Teaching Your Child to Read in 100 Easy Lessons. In these 100 lessons, your child will be reading. And it gives very clear instructions to the teacher, which is really important because, again, we want sources that are easier for us, not like where I have to study, or do all this research and explain. For math specifically, I really like Teaching Textbooks, which is a website that allows you to download software where kids are taught mathematical principles, and then they get to practice on their own. But their curriculum only starts from 3rd grade, but really a 1st or 2nd grader can start it if they're advanced enough. Some other nice resources.
But when it does come to the secular curriculum, I mean, you mentioned earlier how people could be living in certain countries or certain states where their children might have to take this annual exam, right?
Yeah.
Or let's say a parent knows that eventually I want my child to apply for university in country X, right? Isn't the secular curriculum that you would want to follow ideally be one that best prepares and enables your child to pass these exams and to pass these entry tests into universities? Basically following the same curriculum that kids in public schools or private schools are following, but at the very least, you're teaching it to your kid and filtering out whatever you feel is worthy of filtering out, and then teaching it in your own way. Or is that the wrong way of looking at it?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. One interesting thing about that is that public schools are not exactly accomplishing that task. So just following public schools is not really a good idea when it comes to that. So, for example, like for reading, right? One of the things that they emphasize in reading, and that many tests emphasize, which is actually a skill that is somewhat useful, but is actually very problematic, is guessing the meaning of a word through context clues, right? So this is an example when it comes to reading. It's actually not that useful of a skill to teach, because what you actually want to teach a child is how to use a dictionary and how to look up the definition of a word, because otherwise they're going to be guessing the meaning of a word and they could be wrong, right? Like I have done that in my own native language that I'm like somewhat not fluent in anymore, where I guess the meaning of a word based on context, right? I have all the context skills, but I guessed wrong and now I'm using that wrong, right? So schools don't often provide the best pathway for what they say they're providing for, right? What's better is actually looking at the material that is on these exams, right? Which oftentimes there's going to be, two key pieces that everything goes back to, right? And these two key pieces are reading comprehension, right? That a child can understand what they read and explain it back, right? I mean, like actually explain it back, like, okay, this is what I read, whether it is in writing or whether it is in speaking. They need both, but working on both, right? And then the other skill is analytical skills, which can be developed through just moving up in math, right? So whenever a student develops proficiency in these two things, every other subject can come easily, right? So for example, if I understand math well and my reading comprehension is good, well, now chemistry becomes very easy, right? But everything goes back to these two things. The issues with schools is that they're often not doing a good job, with the proficiency levels we talked about earlier, with these two things. So the kids end up not performing so well. And then guess what? What happens is that the wealthier families often will take their students to tutoring anyway, right? And it is important, going back to being resourceful of parents, if they want that path for their child, and the child at that point is already in high school, and this is something that the child wants, is learning more about those tests, because the requirements for those are constantly changing. So for example, in the US, the ACT and SAT are two big tests that don't have the same value that they used to. Some schools are now saying that the ACT is optional. When I was working at the university I was at, while I was there, we decided that the ACT was optional, right? That it's not something that would be required anymore, right? So you see that, it is not only the test score that determines, what program your child is going to get into. Now, if you live in a country where it is, right? Like, let's say, many of, countries that follow more of the British system, right? You can learn more about that testing and, do some Google searches and see which curriculum is most effective, right? But ultimately, they will always come down to these two things: reading comprehension, being able to read and then explain both in writing and in speech, and analytical skills, which you can learn through doing math.
What if one's child needs special accommodations? Is that will that make the task more difficult, or if not impossible?
It depends on the level of accommodation. Every family has a different a different level of needs, right, when it comes to that. Now, as we said, the homeschooling parent needs to be resourceful, right? Now, I think one thing that they need to make sure they understand is that just because your child needs accommodations does not automatically mean that the public school is better for them. It doesn't mean that at all, right? In fact, some school special education programs are absolutely appalling, just terrible, right? I have worked side by side with special ed teachers who were responsible for pulling students out and then giving them extra support on the material. But basically, they functioned like tutors. However, what I noticed is that they themselves were not proficient, right? And the school didn't actually do regular tests on their own proficiency. So you had this, special ed teacher that's pulling out your child for math, but they don't know math themselves and don't feel confident in their own ability, right? So it doesn't, just because a child needs accommodations doesn't mean that public school is the best option. That's really a case-by-case thing, right? But, be resourceful as a parent. Find out more. What are the exact needs of your child? You can find out better than the school does, what the exact needs of your child are, and then build an individual plan based on that.
Okay, here's a difficult question.
Mm-hmm.
What are the disadvantages of homeschooling? And, do homeschoolers miss out on anything?
Oh, yeah, big time. We miss out on free babysitting, right? Right. And the funny thing about that is that it's not free. It's typically coming from your own tax dollars, right?
Yeah.
But this does require, for example, in terms of time management and just house management, right, is that you're not getting that break from your kids, right? So it's really important that you have, going back to that why and communicating and getting everybody on board, for example, if it's a husband and wife team, making sure that you have times where you can get, time off and just sort of de-stress and, have time away from the kids as well, right? Because it's not good for you to be around them 24/7 without ever getting a break either, right? Now, the reason that I mentioned that is because a lot of times this is one of the things that make the public school system just very attractive. And sometimes parents just need to be real with themselves and, admit that, it is the free babysitting that keeps them, going to the public school. Is that parents have this fear of, having my child at home like the whole time, right? Or going like having my child with me, right? I think this is a fear that we really do need to get over, right? Because again, it's those positive memories that we can create that are really going to create the impact of a lifetime, right? That is, can hopefully, inshallah, lead to us having a child that will make dua for us in the long run.
You mentioned earlier that homeschooling is becoming more popular. Do you mean like only among Muslims or even like in the broader, community, among people of different faiths? Is it something that's only popular amongst conservative and religious people, or other people recognizing its secular benefits?
Yeah, it's interesting, like the amount of enemies the public school system has managed to create, right? Like, you have conservative families taking their kids out, liberal families are taking their kids out, right? Homeschooling is definitely on the rise, I think, across all demographics. Really, I think a lot of people are kind of, realizing that, hold up, I don't think this is the most effective system. Right now, some people are able to, transfer, their child to a private school because it is something that they can afford, right? Or a private Islamic school because it's something that they can afford. However, a lot of families can't afford Islamic school. And the other issue that we need to think about is that an Islamic school doesn't necessarily mean that they will uphold all the values that you wish your child to have, right? So, for example, some Islamic schools, what they're doing is that they're just teaching the secular subjects like you teach secular subjects without adding an Islamic perspective. And then they're adding on a Quran program or an Islamic studies program. In some Islamic schools, the other children are a terrible negative influence on your child, right? And it doesn't necessarily provide you a solution for everything, right? So, these are things that we really need to think about. And one thing that I tell parents is, take charge of your child's education. If you feel that public school is the only option, please go to the public school and just observe. If you feel that, you like this particular Islamic school, go to the Islamic school and observe, right? Like, go and see what it's like. This is your investment. You're spending, a big part of your paycheck on it, right? Or a big part of your taxes, and your child is there, right? And, this is the peer influence that they're going to have, see exactly what's going on there, right? I don't think that no one can create this perfect education system, right? But, it's about you knowing your why and seeing if the needs and the requirements that you have for your child are being met in that environment.
I think we do have to acknowledge the reality that, some people are going to just simply say that they simply can't homeschool, right? Regardless, whatever their circumstances are, they can't homeschool at all. Or some of them, some parents are doing is that they're doing a combination of part-time homeschooling and also registering their kids in virtual schools, right? So they see that as some kind of middle ground solution. So you have those parents that would still like their children. They will feel more reassured knowing that their children are studying state approved curriculum or studying curriculum that is accredited by the Ministry of Education in that respective state or country. And their kids are getting these report cards and transcripts and certificates, and they're graduating. He formally finished grade 1, grade 2, but through a virtual school. At the same time, that the virtual school has the advantage of your child being at home, and it depends on the virtual school. So some virtual schools are live, so your kid is actually attending live, or they could be pre-recorded lessons, which the child could access at any time, and you could take your child through those lessons, and they could do the quizzes and the exams, which could be monitored through a webcam, or they could go to a certain location and take an exam and actually pass, right? So a lot of parents are seeing virtual schools as some kind of middle solution in some way. So I would like to get your thoughts on two things. First, those that simply can't homeschool at all, right? It could be due to financial reasons. Both parents have to work, or it could be for any reason. But we'll just accept the claim that they genuinely can't do it, and
Mhm.
those that are thinking of virtual school. Like to get
Mhm.
your thoughts on that. Barakallahu feekum.
Yeah, well, yeah. So, one thing is for those who can't do it at all, and they tried and they know it's not something that can work. With the virtual schools, and virtual schools are different types, right? So there are the public online charter schools now, right? And this, is an available option in the U.S., right? Now, keep in mind the things we talked about some of the issues with public schools, is that your child will be, following an approved curriculum. However, the curriculum itself still might have issues in it. So
Yeah.
either way, whether your child goes to public school or an online public school, right? Whether they're going in person or online, you still need to be involved in your child's education.
Mm.
You still need to be there, right? You still need to find out what it is that your child is learning. And, this is something that I advise all parents, be aware, right? This is a huge responsibility, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you with. It's a huge blessing. It's a huge gift to have children. And it's also a huge responsibility. So you want to make sure you fulfill that. Right. So you still have to, keep an eye on the curriculum, figure out what your child is learning. However, what they will not have is as much as the negative peer influence,
Mm.
right? So it has this advantage, right? Another thing that is tough, though, with the online virtual school is that parents need to be more mindful of too much screen time for their children, even if it's something that is positive, right? Because, this is something that is just not good for a child's health
Yeah.
overall.
Yeah.
And it is kind
I
of
mean,
hard to
that is
maintain.
my concern with the
Yeah.
virtual schools which require live attendance.
Yep. Yep.
As opposed to those that are pre-recording the lessons and letting
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
access it, at
Mhm.
your convenience, right?
Yeah. And you see that like both of those have a different set of pros and cons, right? Because, the online ones, I mean, some of them are requiring students to be online like 6, 7, 8 hours, and I, in my own institute, I make sure that kids are never online for longer than an hour, right? Because it's not good for the child, right? They need to have, a break to just rest their eyes. It's also very easy to get distracted when a child is learning online, and that's just a reality. We have to be honest when it comes to that. The asynchronous, where it's not live, right, has that benefit where a child can get more breaks. But the interesting thing about that is that it gives the parents less breaks now, right? Where now it's like, as a parent, like you have to be like really on top of it of like, okay, where did we leave off? Did we stop at 14 minutes? Like, let's start back up from there. But some parents still might find more reassurance in that, right? Of like, okay, they're following, this approved, curriculum, right? So there's that as well. Now there's this other option that I think is only going to become more and more popular now, which is online Islamic schools,
Mm.
which often charge a cheaper price because they don't have to pay for a physical building,
Mm.
right? So it can really reduce the price. So for example, right now there's Everyday Ibadah, which runs a school that follows the American curriculum. And actually, one of the main people who are involved is, the teacher that I mentioned earlier, Maimuna, where they integrate an Islamic Studies curriculum into a secular curriculum. It's online, right? I don't know the ratio of like synchronous versus asynchronous, how much of it they have to be like physically present for, right? But I know that this is going to be another growing option, right, for parents out there to have an online Islamic school, right? And I think, the prospects for this are really interesting, right? Where the educational world can really change a lot, right? So, another idea that's been on my mind recently is that since so many students attend tutoring now, right? And many of the tutors are following their own curriculums, whether it's, Sylvan or Huntington or Kuman or, other private ones, right? Is the future of education for a lot of Muslim families going to be that instead of an Islamic school, they go to this place for math on Monday and Wednesday. They go to this place for reading and writing on Tuesday and Thursday, and then maybe, do a little bit of supplementation for the other subjects, right? I think that's something that's going to become more popular in the future as well. And I think that there's some good in that, right? Because one thing that I've seen is that now there are more people opening up tutoring services, that cater mostly to a Muslim audience. And, there's an opportunity in that for business people, with an education background, for teachers wishing to leave the indoctrination themselves, teachers who are wishing to, move to primarily teaching Muslim students. So there's just opportunities in that for everyone.
Barakallahu fikum, Akhi Abdirahman. I mean, I have no more questions from my end. Yeah, I mean, I just want to thank you for coming on and and weighing in a lot of these important questions. And inshallah, we pray that this has at least stimulated or motivated some of our viewers to at least consider homeschooling as an option, right? At the end of the day, guidance is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? But at the same time, as Muslims, we do believe in taking the means
Absolutely.
to protecting our deen and cultivating the spiritual, the Islamic spiritual upbringing of our children as well. And I think the argument that is being made here today is that when it comes to educating our children, especially when we're living in certain environments which are not very conducive to the betterment of our iman, that homeschooling has proven time and again as being an effective means of education for our children that results in better upbringing for our children, both in the secular dunyawi sense, but more importantly in the Islamic sense. But at the end of the day, guidance is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The next Shaykh al-Islam could have attended high school, while the next, God forbid, degenerate could have been homeschooled. Guidance is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but we take the means, and if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does ask us what we did to help our children become better Muslims, we have something to answer in response. Before we close off, Akhi Abdirahman, are there any final remarks or any final words that you'd like to make before we end the session?
Absolutely. I just wanted to, I like the recap that you gave, and just emphasizing that point that, that guidance comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. After all, some of the Anbiya, prophets, right, had family members that was misguided, so it's not, it's something that comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ultimately. I just want to conclude with, just reminding all of us, the immense responsibility of parenthood, right? That this is, a huge responsibility. And, just really emphasize that this is going to be something that we're asked about on the Day of Judgment, right? And at the end of the day, when that moment comes for us where our life ends, right, we want to be able to stand before Allah on the Day of Judgment and say that we tried our best. As we all know, once our time comes, that's it. وَلَنْ يُؤَخِّرَ اللَّهُ نَفْسًا إِذَا جَاءَ أَجَلُهَا. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not delay a person's time once it comes, right? So this responsibility of raising children is something that needs to be on our minds, right? And that it can be distracting, thinking about the dunya and obsessing about the dunya. But we have a huge responsibility as parents to handle with care, to the best of our ability, our children, right? Because this is going to be, the future, and this is going to be, the responsibility that we are asked about. This is how big of a topic it is. And also just remind us that, with homeschooling, don't only think of it as a burden, think of it also as a privilege. Think of the words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, man dalla ala khairin falahu mithlu ajri fa'ilih, right? That whoever encourages, good or helps guide towards good, they receive the reward of the doer, right? Without the doer losing any part of this reward. So imagine, the homeschooling parent, right, who takes charge, right? You can be that parent that gives your child, this Islamic upbringing that continues to get rewarded, right? Even after your death, right? That your child is acting on this knowledge, that your child is striving to learn more because of this upbringing that you gave them. And yes, it will come at a sacrifice, but ultimately it is worth it. And I ask Allah Azza wa Jal to make us of those who are proud of their efforts on the Day of Judgment, and to make us parents that are proud of the way they fulfill their responsibilities. As Allah Azza wa Jal says about the believers, لِسَعْيِهَا رَاضِيَةٌ, that they're pleased with their journey, they're pleased with their efforts. They knew that they would meet Allah and that they would be questioned, and they knew that they gave it their best effort. So I ask Allah to make us of them. As far as we can have some additional resources. I also provide homeschooling consultations for parents, who just need help setting up their homeschooling, or who need curriculum recommendations. And if I encourage people to just comment and share this video as well. You can ask questions in the comments as well, and I'll get to them. Inshallah, I'd love to see the discussions that come out of this as well. And I just wanted to say thank you for having me on, Brother Bassam. This has been something that I have really been looking forward to, and I hope that Allah Azza wa Jal rewards you for providing this opportunity, and that this can be, ilm that continues on after we pass.
Ameen, ameen. Barakallahu fikum, Akhi Abdirahman. It's been an honor having you on the channel, and Jazakallah khairan for all your efforts. And we'll end on that note, and I will bid you and our viewers with the farewell greetings of Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.